Hello and welcome to this edition of RLive, a program in which we gather a group of experts to discuss important issues for audience in our broadcast region, as well as policymakers, regional analysts in the media. Today we are here to discuss the recent wave of intensified fighting in northern Afghanistan, alongside the border with Central Asia, and how it is drawing Russia deeper into the Central Asia and what we should expect in the future as a consequence. To discuss the subject, I have from Kabul, Mustafa Bagh. He's a veteran journalist of Afghan affairs, currently working for Euronews, and he has previously reported from Afghanistan for the Turkish television and TV and Jihan news agency. He was literally in Afghan Central Asia border just a few days ago. From Exeter, David Luis is among us. He's currently lectures at the University of Exeter and previously worked in the Central Asia side of Afghan border for the International Crisis Group as it is Central Asia director. In Prague, I have my colleague Bruce Panier, who looks into both sides of the border through his blog called Kishlag Oazi at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I am Mohammed Tahir, director of the Turkmen service at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, also host of the another talk show called Majlis, which we run together with Bruce Panier every week. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hello, it's from Kabul.
Thank you very much for being with us. At the beginning, I also want to remind our audience, while watching the show, please consider participating in it with your questions and comments through Facebook and Twitter using hashtag RFERLIVE. So, Mustafa, let's start with you. I remember days when we were ruling together in the streets of Kabul, when the lord of the town was not clear, whether it is under the Taliban or the administration, which we were hoping that will come sometime in the future. I'm talking about this early days of the the new administration in Afghanistan. Obviously, situation since then got only worse in Kabul, in surrounding areas in different parts. But then, and also later in years to come, northern Afghanistan considered to be oasis in the fire in Afghanistan. So describe us, please, situation on the ground. What kind of changes you have seen since your last trip there?
Well, normally, we're talking about the current situation in the North Afghanistan. You know, I used to live in this country since 18 years. During the Mujahideen time, I was here, and then, you know, during the Taliban, and then the American invasion, and then NATO's involvement, etc. So normally, northern Afghanistan would be supposed to be more and more safe and secure region. But recently, it's just getting, you know, as you mentioned, I mean, it's just getting, compared to the south, more and more, I mean, the Taliban and the other armed groups are just being involved, especially in the border region like Kunduz, Faryab, Herat. So this is scaring administration, this is scaring Kabul management. In the meantime, people in the North Afghanistan was not expecting, so it's just all of a sudden, you know, I wasn't really expecting that much, you know, quick changes in North Afghanistan. Normally, Taliban is having its power from south region of the country generally, but now, I mean, in recent time, when I see not only southern people, but also in the north, you can see it's obvious, and it is difficult to understand. As you know, a few days ago, Kunduz has been attacked by Taliban, and they captured the city. And yesterday evening, hundreds of Taliban members, they attacked in the Faryab, some parts of the Faryab, and they also yesterday evening they attacked on some districts in Herat, which is in the northwest part of the country. So when you calculate all of them, it's like, what is going on? I mean, it's a bit difficult to understand the situation.
Right, right. Mustafa, there are not so many people with first-hand information like you have. Colleagues, with your permission, I have a follow-up question to Mustafa, and I also encourage you to feel free to cross-question each other. Mustafa, you were with Vice President General Dostum, Dostum's convoy just 1 month ago in Faryab province, when he was taking fight on the militants there on the ground. For the brief moment after that operation, it sounded like militants were pushed out from the area. But as soon as Dostum returned to Kabul, it seems that militants got even a larger portion of the territory back. So you have Dostum again in Faryab today. I think he arrived yesterday. So again on the battlefield. Why is that? Is it not under the control of any authority, or what's happening there?
When he was in the north, when he was kind of clearance operation in the northern cities, including Shibirgan and Faryab and the other city. It's like I interviewed him in Kohistanat after Shibirgan, and we talked to him. I talked to him. What is going on? He said that I cleared the cities that I traveled. So he cleared, as he mentioned, and he said that more than 1,000 Taliban members surrendered to them. So they were in the region to fight. Okay, in the Maimana, they had an intensive fight. Okay, I mean, it was very, like weeks and weeks. I mean, it continued. And in the end, he said that he told me, it is fine now. I mean, there is no problem in the region now. As soon as you mentioned it, he returned back to Kabul and then to live out of the country. We saw that, I witnessed that. I mean, insurgents is coming back to their hometowns. I mean, it is a bit ununderstandable. But what experts are telling me is the government forces, not his, I mean, not General Dostum's, his fighters, but the security forces. They can't resist because, like in the south, I'm hearing the complaints about the situation. They're saying that from the central government they want permission to fight, but they can't. This is what some of them telling me. They're trying to make an operation, but they don't have the permission. So, and also, I'll come back to the northern Afghanistan. When Dostum was there, okay, he cleared the area. When he returned back, some people, I don't know, I mean, I can't rely on this idea, but people are saying that the soldiers, security forces who are belong to, the government security forces, they just returning back. They don't guard the points that they standing, because Taliban is coming. They fighting. These guys, I mean, security forces, Afghan soldiers, Afghan policemen, or ALP, Afghan local police. They are the people who are working in the army with $200, I mean, monthly. So maybe the idea, they don't want to risk their life. I don't know. I mean, but it's one of the reasons that they can't keep the region. This is what we discussed here in Kabul with other friends, with other colleagues. What is going on? I mean, Dostum was there. Okay, he is fighting, he is clearing, then he is returning back, and then insurgents coming back. I mean, they getting the point that they're there and even more stronger. So it is a bit, tricky. I mean, it's a bit hard to understand the situation because, as I said, they are the people who are working in the army, and they have like salaries monthly, $200, $150. Maybe they didn't want to risk their lives. This is one of the reasons, as I understand.
Yeah, Bruce wants to jump in, please.
Yeah, Mustafa, I just want to ask you too. You just referred to the Taliban forces, and I know that the government has often spoken in exactly those terms and said, you know, we're the Taliban. At the same time, we know that there's other people, the allies of the Taliban, and this relates more to the Central Asian thing. But we know that there's foreign fighters mixed in with them. When you were up north, did you get any kind of sense of one? How the mixture is of these foreign fighters, many of whom are believed to have come from the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and also is there any sense of who's actually in command of among these forces, the combined Taliban foreign fighters? Do we know who's running the show up there?
Well, in fact, this is what government forces, what government's saying. I mean, there are foreign fighters among them. I mean, some Central Asians, some Pakistanis, some Arabs, and some from eastern Xinjiang region. So, you know, I haven't contacted them. I mean, I didn't meet with them, but I didn't see them. But all I can tell you, I mean, what General Dostum told me, he arrested some Pakistanis. He said that there are some other, I mean, ethnic groups from Central Asia. Yeah, they are the fighters, but also the locals joining them. Not only Taliban, but also Haqqani group, but like also IMU, like also IS, I mean ISIS, Islamic ISL. So I haven't met with them directly, or I haven't seen them. Although what I heard, yeah, there are foreign fighters. They coming through generally from North Afghanistan, and also they're using the
yeah. Situation is, you know, very fluent to describe it best, Mustafa. And we are talking about Faryab province here, and that's a province which has a border with Turkmenistan. Mustafa, just to, you know, if you can answer briefly. So when you were there, was there a sense of control on the ground, like sense of the authority on the ground, or it's like a forest? I mean, there's no control, there's no government, there's nothing.
What people told me, yeah, there are.
Who's in charge there?
Yeah, the government forces are there, but you see, in the urban areas, when you go out of the city, there is not government forces. You can't keep them there. There are insurgents. They're coming with motorbikes. They're coming with horses. And the government forces cannot fight with them there because they are strong. I mean, they come in there, like, I mean, targeting and just escaping, hitting and escaping. So it is a bit difficult. But yeah, there's a sense of control. You see the government forces, but yet you just see them. Around the city, like in Herat, like in Antkhoy, like in Faryab, like in Jan Shibirdan is so, I mean, it's fine, but I mean, around the city, it is hard to see the presence of the government forces. Even if they go, they just go. They don't, I mean, directly want to be in touch with the insurgents. Or the other side, I mean, the Taliban side, or I mean, the other armed groups, they don't want to come, like, I mean, face to face. They don't want to fight with government forces. They just hit and escape.
Right. Dr. Luis, I will come to you in a minute. I was just talking to one of my colleagues here in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. His name is Amin Mudakik, director of Radio Mashal, who just returned from in northern Afghanistan. He was telling me that the northern Afghanistan became way dangerous than even southern Afghanistan. When we are talking about southern Afghanistan as Kandahar in Helmand, because in the north, he says, there's a huge, issue of chain of command. Either you are talking about militants or the government side, as Mustafa just was saying. According to him, it makes situation even more dangerous. Bruce, today before we were talking, actually you were showing me a map which is just released by the United Nations and indicating flashpoints in Afghanistan. On that map too, Central Asian border was, all red. all red, meaning, I mean, to describe it, properly, critical. And so again, as Mustafa mentioned, then we had the fall of Kunduz, although it's taken back later. But how we got into this point, Bruce? Let's continue with you.
I mean, I think that, well, there's a couple things to remember. One, the problems all started after the Pakistani military launched its offensive in the spring of last year. It pushed a lot of these militant groups, for the so-called foreign fighters that are now in Afghanistan, out of the Pakistani tribal areas and into northern Afghanistan. As you rightly mentioned at the start of this program, northern Afghanistan had been pretty peaceful, but foreign forces had withdrawn and there was a vacuum up there. And since there hadn't been a recent history of the area suffering great problems, I don't think the Afghan government really took the security threat very seriously up there. It seemed like things were more or less all right up there. So now you have this influx of foreign fighters all of a sudden into an area which is poorly guarded, at least at the time was poorly guarded. The Taliban seem to have taken advantage of this by everyone expecting that they were going to attack mostly in the eastern parts and in the southern provinces. You mentioned Helmand, Kandahar, places like that. And it seems that very early on, when their trouble started in the north, the Taliban realized that this was potentially a good strategy for them, that the government couldn't mass forces in Helmand and Kandahar area or around Kabul or around Jalalabad if they had this other problem going on in the northern part of the country. So now, as a result of that, and you referred to that map, we have all the 7 of the 8 provinces that border Central Asia now are identified as having extreme problems, security problems in the area. I was struck by that map, especially that in the Badakhshan and Kunduz area, right near the Tajik border, and that's where it is by Tajikistan, it showed it was white space, indicating that it wasn't as bad as in other places, whereas the entire Turkmen border with Afghanistan practically was colored in as being a potential flashpoint zone.
Right. Dr. Lewis, what is your reading of the situation when you look at this from Central Asia? Are they aware what's happening right next to their border? And if they do, what they are doing about it?
Yes, I think they're pretty aware. They are obviously concerned about what's going on, and I think in particular the temporary fall of Kunduz frightened a lot of people in Tajikistan in particular. I mean, I think because the situation is so confused in northern Afghanistan and therefore rather unpredictable, it's quite hard for governments to know how to react. And we've seen lots of different reactions. One has been to turn towards Russia for assistance. That's been the Tajik reaction, but with lots of sort of caveats around that. The Tajiks don't want Russians back on the border necessarily, but they do want some kind of assistance. The Uzbeks and the Turkmen, on the other hand, they want to handle it themselves. The Uzbeks can probably do that. They've got a pretty well-developed military. Their part of the border is pretty well defended. The Turkmens, on the other hand, have a pretty poor set of security structures. The border is not very well guarded, and so they're seen perhaps as the most vulnerable now of these 3 states. But on top of all this, of course, you've got this whole geopolitical play in which Russia is playing a sort of multiple game. It's not only trying to provide security assistance and support, it also has its geopolitical goals in the region as well, consolidating its position in Central Asia, in these former Soviet republics, and also asserting itself in what Russians are now calling Greater Eurasia, this sort of band of territory from Syria through Iraq and northern Afghanistan, where Russia feels it has real interests, real strategic interests now. So that makes it a very complicated situation in which you don't have a common group of countries that are working towards a common goal. You have all sorts of multiple motivations and multiple goals, and that makes it pretty dangerous and unpredictable.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Bruce, you just had a very intriguing blog post describing the situation in northern Afghanistan, particularly when it comes to Turkmenistan, in which you try to study the reason behind resistance of Turkmenistan, even the border issues he mentioned in the media. So what's your feeling about the Turkmens? What they are planning to do? What is their position in this?
Well, of course, certainly they're aware that there's a problem. I'm still kind of mystified by their denial, their public denial of it. It seems like there could have been another way of admitting that there was a problem, which everyone understands is present there, and downplaying it to some extent, but to just flatly reject that there is even any issues, security issues down along the border, just seem preposterous to me because it flies in the face of reality. Yeah. Now clearly for domestic consumption, they're going to have to say that there is no problem. The last thing in the world they want is for their own population to get the idea that there might be some kind of security problems, fractures along the southern border. They've promised for years and years that this policy of positive neutrality was the ultimate guarantee of peace in the country. And as I pointed out in the paper too, now you have the head of a neighboring state coming forward and all of a sudden saying, no, we know there's a problem. This is bad. It's hard to cover that kind of stuff up. And at the same time, Turkmenistan wants to keep good relations with a country like Kazakhstan, with which it shares a very border. But they went into damage control, and I think it was too much of a knee-jerk reaction that they overreacted too quickly to this. And I'd also like to ask Dr. Lewis, since he's on the show, we were talking the other day, it seemed to me that when Nazarbayev made the comment about the border being insecure after meeting with President Putin. Yeah. Now the Turkmen responded to Nazarbayev, and the Kazakh Foreign Ministry responded back to the Turkmen Foreign Ministry, but it seemed to me, Dr. Lewis, that Nazarbayev was speaking for Putin, and that this was actually a conversation between Ashgabat and Moscow, in which Nazarbayev unfortunately became the middleman. It seemed, especially in light of the fact that the next day the CIS came out with this idea of a common border force and the need for cooperation along the border. It seemed to me that this was Russia driving this, and poor President Nazarbayev. That's probably not the best way to put it, but anyway, he found himself unfortunately caught up between what is essentially a conversation between Ashgabat and Moscow, and not between Ashgabat and Astana. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right. This is, the denial is, in a way, they're not denying reality so much as pushing back on a Russian initiative to try and put more Russian security structures in place in the region. And the Russians, on one hand, they see Turkmenistan as a potential weak point in this Afghan Central Asian border. And on the other hand, of course, they also seen Turkmenistan as and Uzbekistan as both countries that have flirted with the West at various points in terms of potential energy exports and in terms of security ties. Bear in mind, of course, when Putin was meeting with Nazarbayev, the Turkmen foreign minister was in Washington, right, talking to U.S. State Department about, including many other things, but certainly about security on the border. So that was interpreted in Moscow as a slight, and it appears, certainly from the Russian press, that the Russian defense minister, Shoigu, was planning a trip to Ashgabat, which was then postponed or cancelled. So we've seen this shift in Turkmen policy where they push back on Russian attempts really to, from Moscow's point of view, you might say, improve relations. From Turkmenistan's point of view, they clearly feel under a really good deal of pressure from Moscow, and they don't like it, and they're trying to find ways out. But unfortunately, Turkmenistan is not a country with a huge number of friends in the world. It's a hugely repressive state, as we all know, and so looking for support in the West is not very easy. And its other ally, which is China, is interested in the commercial aspects, but I suspect is less interested in getting involved in security assistance in a direct way. So the Turkmens, and I think the Uzbeks, are in quite a difficult position, I think. It'll be really interesting to see what happens.
Right. Obviously we're talking about the intensified security developments in the border, but some also argue that situation in Afghanistan has never been good, and which is, in Central Asians have always lived with Afghanistan like that, with this kind of security situation. There is nothing unique what's happening today there. So both of us heard these arguments, Bruce, actually time and again. I will give a chance to talk about this a little bit later. But Mustafa, who's on the ground, he's an outsider for the discussion what we used to have in the company, and also Mustafa is someone who's following the developments on the ground. So Mustafa, based on your trips over the past several years, today, is there anything different when it comes to cross-border threat from Afghanistan to Central Asia? Obviously, you described how situation looks like today on the ground, but in terms of talking about the possibility of cross-border threat, what is different today? Is it different at all?
Well, in the past, from Central Asia viewpoint, in the past, there was only Taliban threat for them, from Central Asians like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or Turkmenistan. But now, recently, we're hearing that Daesh, ISIS, is having more and more ground in the region. And according to the reports, that at least in 25 cities, provinces of Afghanistan, there is Daesh, you know. This is what, just a month ago, speech published. So this means from Central Asian viewpoint, now they have Taliban, now they have the Daesh threat. So, you know, after the announcement of the Mullah Omar's death, you know, there was discussion in Taliban, inside the Taliban, of the leadership. And in that moment, people were talking, people were discussing about the radical fractions of Taliban would join to ISIS. So they already are here, and the radical fractions of Taliban, if they would join Daesh as well, or ISIS, so it would be like a double threat for the Central Asian countries, for the cross-border. This means that they can anytime like export this threat to the Central Asian countries. Anyhow, you have some groups in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan. I'm not talking about the Turkmenistan because there is not much this kind of armed groups in Turkmenistan, no. But in Uzbekistan and in Tajikistan, yes. So it would be like, you know, like domino effect coming to the north, and then from here exporting this kind of, from the point threat to the other Central Asian countries, which can be like, because possible because, you know, some fighters of ISIS is, as we know, coming from Uzbekistan. And so, yeah, it can be like transferred to the Central Asian countries as well from the border region.
You know, obviously there are lots of rumors, but the fact is that there are more fighting in the north alongside the Central Asian border, more militants, and among them are Central Asians there, and we don't know the size of them, number of them, but they are there, and you hear their name mentioned by various Afghan officials after each fighting, what role they played and where they were in the front line and the back line. To best of your knowledge, Mustafa, why these militants are coming there to northern Afghanistan and who they are? I'm talking about the foreign militants.
Yeah, it is hard to answer this question. Why they coming? But, you know, they have more safe region because Afghan government and NATO was not expecting that. Northern part of country will be suddenly, you know, will be like this. For the Pakistani border or Iranian border, the southern part of the country, you understand because there was already, insurgent groups there, armed groups. But in North Afghanistan, there was no expectation. Nobody was expecting that they would be, having suddenly so strong. Okay, Kunduz is a strategic place, as usual. In history, as you remember, Taliban was very strong in Kunduz, and then the North Afghanistan just collapsed after Mujahideen when they came to the North Afghanistan in 1997, 1998. So Kunduz was very important. We understand it, but what about the Faryab? What about Juzjan? What about the other cities around? I mean, in the Anthoy. Now you see more and more, even more than southern regions. You have every day, daily fights in the North Afghanistan, and as I said, fighters coming from North Afghanistan, it's more easy for them maybe to come to the Afghanistan, and it's easy for them to be staying there. Geographically, it allows them to be there, to have a ground there. I'm not talking about the Panjshir area. I'm talking about the border region. So it's a bit hard to predict why what will happen or why they came here. I don't really know, but I can tell you they have a ground there, and they have a support in the ground. That's why they can stay there.
No. David, now we need your help in this phase. You also mentioned this, looking into the situation the way it is, more bad news, more fighting and more militants, plus you have a declaration by the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan to join so-called Islamic State in Iraq, in Syria. Now these developments are cause for serious concern, as you mentioned, for Vladimir Putin of Russia. He warned last week in a CIS meeting about possible incursion of militants to Central Asia. David, is Russia playing politics here, or it is genuinely believing so?
I think it's a bit of both, and politics is always most important, particularly in Russian policy. Let's bear in mind the point you made before, which is that for many years the Central Asian states survived quite well with the Taliban on the other side of the border,
right.
And so there's always been some skepticism about the claim that incursions will threaten these regimes, right, from cross-border militant groups. I think now, as we're hearing, the situation may be changing, particularly with these more radical groups emerging, who are focused on more transnational, if you like, jihadism rather than simply on the Afghan civil war. But nevertheless, it's worth being a little bit skeptical about the idea that this is simply about a Russian response to the emergence of ISIS in Afghanistan, or to the fear of the Taliban crossing the border. This is a crisis, of course, but Russia is using this crisis very effectively for its own geopolitical goals. We saw that in Astana, the idea of putting together a joint border force, for example. The Russians have been trying to push back on their expulsion from the border for some years now, because they see that as a key sort of security band for them in their broader sort of defense mechanism. But also because it gives a huge amount of political control, right? If you get back on the Uzbek or Turkmen borders, it really helps you to control the politics of those countries, right? And bear in mind, all these countries, which appear to be strong authoritarian regimes, as we all know, have this real brittle fragility to them. Uzbekistan, you saw Islam Karimov, president, up in Astana last week. He looks, frankly, somewhat weak, very elderly, and at some point that succession crisis is going to hit, and Russia is also positioning itself to be in a position to influence that process. So there's lots of layers here, and the concern about ISIS and militant groups crossing the border is just one of many elements that are driving Russian policy, I'd say. Probably not the most important one.
I know, Bruce, you want to jump in. If the situation is obviously bad in the northern Afghanistan, as Mustafa mentioned, if you would be Vladimir Putin, Dr. Lovis, looking into the border, how would you react differently when it comes to security?
Well, if I were Vladimir Putin, I'd do a lot of things differently, maybe. But I think, from Moscow's point of view, of course, this makes some kind of sense, right? But bear in mind, it's also fueled by this geopolitical view that sees the West as the enemy, right? More or less now. this battle around the sort of Afghan border is now also seen as a potential proxy war, and Afghanistan returning to that uncomfortable place of being between the West and Russia potentially. It hasn't quite come to that yet, but that's the way the thinking is going. And so from Moscow's point of view, it's also important for them to close down the possibility of the West having influence in Central Asia, in Turkmenistan or in Uzbekistan, for example. And that's been one of the driving goals of Russian policy for several years now. They pushed the Americans out of Kyrgyzstan, of course. They had an airbase there. And they would now like to consolidate Russian control across the region, not recreating the Soviet Union, but simply developing some pro-Moscow leaderships in each of these republics and the ability to interact with them in security terms. So from Putin's point of view, if you have the worldview that Putin has, as it were, this all makes perfect sense. This is a logical, strategic plan. The problem for it, well, there's two problems. One is that things are much more complicated, perhaps, than sometimes seems from Moscow. And secondly, it's quite expensive. It may involve a level of overstretch for a Russian security establishment that's now effectively involved in some kind of security operations on 3 different fronts, or maybe if you include North Caucasus, right? So there's a danger of Russia going too far here in a region where we know historically, of course, Russia's got some pretty bitter memories and very unfortunate past.
Yeah. Bruce, you want to jump in? I know.
Yeah, I do, but we should do our promo spot too, real quick. So.
Yeah, this is RLive, and we welcome our audience to participate in the show by sending their questions through using hashtag RFERLIVE. We are talking about situation in northern Afghanistan and what does it mean to Central Asia. When it comes to Central Asia, Bruce, so about the statement by Vladimir Putin last week in Astana, what was the general reaction by Central Asian leaders to that?
Well, there
is lots of politics, there are lots of security issues, as Dr. Lewis said.
Right, and I do want to follow up on what Dr. Lewis was talking about, because of course there is a security threat along the Central Asian Afghan border. The severity of it is debatable, but I think what undercuts Russia's credibility when they start talking about these threats is that we've heard this story for so long. In the late 1990s, Moscow was saying the same thing about the Taliban. Look out, they're coming, they're going to come across the border, you need help, you can't do it by yourself. And then even as of 4 or 5 years ago, before the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State was making news, you had, again, the Russian FSB and Russian security structures saying, the IMU is reforming itself and the Taliban are coming back and this is a threat that's going to hit Central Asia and you have to start planning for this and you need help to deal with it. Okay, so now we've just switched the name of the threat. But so this gets to be repetitious after a while. They have new actors that they name as being the threat to Central Asia, but there's always a threat to Central Asia. And so the Central Asians have heard this again and again, that you're under threat. And sometimes with the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, there has been some incursions and some problems. Nothing that would have overthrown any of the governments in the region, certainly. But it's just this. It's almost like a parrot or something. Moscow keeps using this line. Now it's the Islamic State, and and we understand it's a transnational threat. It's probably greater ultimately than the Taliban, which is more or less just a national movement. For Russia to come out and say again that. Hey, look out, there's trouble, is nothing new. We've been hearing this for almost 20 years now, and so it's hard to say how the Central Asian governments are actually going to receive this. Now, Tajikistan has lots of assurances. They have Russian troops on the ground. They're getting help with border security, not just from Russia, but from the United States, the European Union, China, people like that. So Uzbekistan seems to feel confident, although they have a relatively short border with Afghanistan, 160 kilometers, so there's less to guard for them. Turkmenistan, I think still somewhere deep down inside they have a feeling that no matter who comes to power in the adjacent areas along their border, they'll be able to come to a deal like they did in the late 1990s. That might be false hope on their part, but I come back to what Vladimir Putin said last week. Again, it's nothing new. It's nothing we haven't heard before. So the Central Asians, when they hear this message, they're going to understand, yes, potentially there's a threat, but in the meantime, they're also going to understand that Russia has hyped threats from Afghanistan for a long time now.
Sure, but here's the question, Bruce. I mean, in the past, whatever the situation might be in the northern Afghanistan, but as Mustafa was describing, today it is in the fire. Like we have been reporting about Faryab province, for example, the fighting again is going on today. And yesterday we had a news of fighting coming out from Herat province too. Things looks a little bit different, but I also have to include here one Twitter question. We are receiving questions from Twitter. Again, it is in this line. The question says, geopolitics aside, to what extent can Central Asian forces manage the border situation on their own? I mean, we discussed about the increasingly volatile northern Afghanistan. There is something different compared to several years ago.
Well, to start with Uzbekistan, I think they will be able to manage it very well. They have a very large army, and again, they have a very short border with Afghanistan, and they've been preparing for this, for many, many years, well over a decade. They've been fortifying their border with Afghanistan, so they're probably in pretty good shape. Tajikistan has a very long mountainous border. It's some 1,200 kilometers long. They've never been able to keep out drug smugglers, for one thing. And the same routes that drug smugglers use can be used by small groups of militants, I suppose. That said, it's unclear how much damage these militants could do once they're inside Tajikistan. How far can they actually get? What would be their ability to assemble? And of course, we know that Tajikistan has Russian troops on the ground too, so they can count on some backing. Turkmenistan, of course, is the big question. Their border is 744 kilometers long. It's relatively flat terrain, but it's also relatively uninhabited, especially in the eastern parts of the country. So that remains a big question. Tajik troops have been in shootouts with smugglers and other groups along the Afghan border for a very long time. Uzbekistan from time to time, but Turkmenistan, this is kind of uncharted territory for them. They really don't have a lot of experience trying to guard their border using arms. So we don't know what their fighting capability is because they've never been called on to fight. The Turkmen government has concentrated its efforts since independence on the internal threat, not the external threat. So now they're faced with a new challenge that they've never had before. As we pointed out more than a year and a half ago, that Turkmenistan has become the Achilles heel of Central Asian security because no one knows how they will react, and the chances to infiltrate Central Asia through Turkmenistan are much greater than they are at neighboring Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. It's something Uzbekistan has to be concerned about because you can get into Turkmenistan and get into Uzbekistan from Turkmenistan fairly easily. That might account for some of the Berdi Muhamedov's recent visit to Tashkent, for instance, where I'm sure they wanted to discuss what the situation was along the Turkmen-Afghan border, and what they might need to do to fortify the Uzbek-Turkmen border a little bit in the future too. So I would say, can they handle it on their own? Uzbekistan, yes. Turkmenistan, we don't know. Tajikistan already is in a position where it doesn't have to handle it on its own.
Right, and whether it's from the Russian point of view, whether it's a politics or there is a genuine threat to Central Asia, this is something. But in one of the RFRL report in recent days, our colleague Fruit Bijan used the headline of assertive Russia, right? This is the way it's pronounced. A very good article. I recommend everyone to read that on RFRL website. This headline very much fits here. I want to know how far the assertive Russia could go in this argument, behind this argument. Dr. Lewis, would you like to take the question?
Well, I don't think, you're not going to see Russian land forces crossing the border into Afghanistan anytime soon, of course. There's been talk of the Afghan government requesting military assistance from Russia. There may be some equipment, for example, helicopters. Their main approach has been to try and consolidate the existing regimes in place and, where possible, include a sort of Russian security component to their defense. In other words, the Tajik model, if you like, which is to have a local strongman, a Russian base, and to mix up those forces in a way that is a relatively low-cost way of asserting Russian control and also providing some level of security guarantees to a country. In the case of Uzbekistan-Turkmenistan, they don't have that, so I would expect Russia to be putting more and more pressure on those countries to at least start to cooperate with the Russians in some way, to talk to them about this potential of a joint border force, for example, to start some level of military cooperation. I think that both those states are going to resist that pretty strongly there, so that's going to be the most interesting aspect, and I think Tashkent will be the city to watch to see how those geopolitics play out. But I think Russia doesn't want to get overstretched, that's understandable, but it does see this as a very important geopolitical opportunity to reassert itself as really the key security actor in the wider Eurasian region. What goes on in Afghanistan itself is the other question, whether Russia will play more of a role in relation to the government there. And now that, of course, the US drawdown has been delayed, that will, I think, limit the extent of Russian involvement. But I think Russia's watching this very carefully to see what opportunities it has to reassert it, definitely.
Mustafa, you're in Afghanistan. What are the Afghans? How do they view a potential increased Russian role in affairs?
Especially considering the bloody history between Afghanistan and Russia of the 80s and 90s.
Yes.
Well, Afghanistan, Afghans and Russia, Soviet Russia, they have very bloody history, so almost 10 years of invasion. So from Afghans' viewpoint, Afghans never think that Russia will be able to come back to Afghanistan or to be involved again in these issues. But all this, what Afghans saying, or what Afghans are thinking, I don't really know what they're thinking, but my impression from Afghans, so once they came here, they get their lessons, so no more Afghanistan for Russians. This is for sure. Helping Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan, like Tajikistan, or military support to the Central Asian countries, it can happen. But Afghans, ordinary Afghan people thinking that Afghans, one had their lesson, so no more Afghanistan for Russians. In these issues, Kabul government is talking to Turkmenistan, to Uzbekistan, and to Tajikistan directly, themselves. After the northern Afghanistan, as you remember, Rashid Dostum, vice president of the Afghanistan, he was in Russia and Chechnya, and he met with the Russians. Maybe they kind of trying to talk, balance with Moscow as well. But as the doctor and the other colleague, they mentioned it. Well, I can tell you, they can. Russia can have a presence in Central Asia, but this doesn't mean that they will be directly involved, because even though Central Asian countries are the background of Russia, but still, I don't think that Afghans think that Russia will be involved again. Bombing ISIS in Syria or in the Middle East will have some results for Russia. This is what I guess. Maybe they're trying to kind of protect themselves. Maybe these moves are, these steps are for that one. But this doesn't mean that Russia will be involved fully in this issue in Central Asia and Afghanistan directly. They can push, they can support, but not fully on the table.
Right. It is still question whether Russia, how far Russia goes in terms of its involvement with Central Asians. But if it does go, this assertive Russia, if it does push the way Dr. Lewis you mentioned here, what's the options of Central Asia? Do they stand the chance to refuse it? For example, in terms of Turkmenistan, it seems that they don't want any Russian presence in its soil. I mean, but does it has a chance to refuse it?
Well, I suppose we get back to the Turkmen denial of any problems along their border is this is one of the reasons where they don't want to even give, a little bit of room for Russia to come in and say, look, you already are having security problems, and here's a good example. So, that in some way, to some extent, that's one of the reasons why Turkmenistan last week said we don't have any problems along our border. They don't want to give the impression that there's any need for any help from any outside actors, at least that they have an appeal to themselves. And we know that they have asked the U.S. for military assistance or security assistance, at least, along their southern border. But they don't want to give the impression that there's any kind of problem. So they're probably going to stick with that line as long as they can, specifically to not
How long
Russia.
they can, by the way?
Well, so that's the question. We know, despite their denials, the denials in Turkmenistan, we get information from the Afghan side of the border too. So if it should come to a point where the information coming out of Afghanistan is so overwhelming that in fact there has been a major incident along the border, the Turkmen government will probably still deny that there has been anything happening. They deny earthquakes. They deny, they didn't even say there was a bomb, that the U.S. was bombing, in late 2001. But if there's enough international press coverage of something that really does, say a group of militants, just for example, does cross the border, gets into Turkmenistan, blows up something, the refinery in Seydi, or the gas pipelines that are running through the south or something like that, it's going to be hard to cover that up. Exactly. And then this would be the moment when the Kremlin would say, you clearly aren't capable of dealing with this threat on your own. And you're going to need to start thinking about help to deal with this, because it's not just a question, and it really isn't. It's not just a question of Turkmenistan's security, but if Turkmenistan has problems, there's a ripple effect that goes out on the region, and that's what Kazakhstan's been saying, and that's what Russia says ultimately too. Is that it's not if it starts in Turkmenistan, that's one thing, but the effects will be felt much further abroad, and that's something that the Turkmen government has to take into consideration, that they're not just talking about their own security, they're talking about regional security. Yeah. So that's, like I said, as long as the Turkmen government can portray the border as being stable and secure, then it'll work for them and work for their policy of neutrality. But if there should come a time when it is undeniable that something bad has happened inside Turkmenistan, just across the border, the Kremlin would certainly put as much pressure on Turkmenistan as is possible. And it might be that a lot of other international actors that are kind of on Turkmenistan's side to keep Russia out, the United States, the European Union, even China to some extent, would have to accept the fact that there is a threat and that Turkmenistan is not responding as to the extent that it should.
Right. Yeah, we're kind of running out of time. Let's briefly talk about this. Where all these developments are taking us, like how to predict the future, both in terms of militants' activity in the in northern Afghanistan and the assertive Russia and Central Asia being sandwiched between them. Dr. Lewis?
Well, I think it's very unpredictable. It's not a very helpful answer, I know, but we're really relying on people on the ground in Afghanistan who can try and get a sense, as we've heard today, of where that's going. But from my point of view, I think Russia's policy has a pretty clear trajectory, which is about reasserting itself in this broader region as a major player, not the only player, but a major player. And I think that will continue. So I think we'll see more Russian attempts to assert itself diplomatically and also in various security ways. Russia doesn't want to deploy a lot of troops in the region, of course. It doesn't want a high cost deployment in any way, but it simply wants to be really the sort of default security provider, perhaps, for the region. We haven't mentioned China, which obviously has major economic interests in the region. And one interesting question would be whether China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization also starts to at least articulate a view on what's going on in the region and starts perhaps also to assist some of the Central Asian states. That may be a different vehicle that people like the Uzbeks and the Turkmens may look at, some kind of relationship with China. But I think the trajectory of Russian involvement in the region is on the up, but they will meet lots of resistance from Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, so it may be that they won't achieve exactly what they're looking for.
Right. Mustafa, from your point of view, being on the ground in Afghanistan, from the militants' activities point of view, how do you see the future developments? How you predict that? What do you expect to see in upcoming 2-3 years to happen?
Well, in about 2 or 3 years' term, I don't really know what's going to happen. I think change that much. We can't. I mean, we will not see major changes in the region because the United States and NATO is going to be here. I mean, their presence is, will continue here, as Obama mentioned it a few days ago. So we might see the situation in the north if the government, if the central government, I mean the Kabul administration is able to keep the region under control, then I don't think that there will be, I mean, major changes. But if not, then we can see, yeah, of course, I mean, there might be some unpredicted and like unwanted situation just came out, like in Kunduz. I mean, from the viewpoint of the Afghans. And yeah, militants were here even during the NATO. In the past 14 years, there were insurgents, there were, I mean, clashes, there were the presence of Taliban and the other insurgent, I mean, armed groups. So, as I said, I mean, if Kabul government keeps the north under control, and if the people in north don't feel themselves as an isolated or as being like, I mean, excluded of the overall situation in Afghanistan, so nothing will change. But as far as I understand, in the north, people are not happy with the, I mean, warlords, and people are not happy with the situation that they complaining. And, you know, the drug smugglers and blah, blah. I mean, there are some issues that Afghan society are complaining that Kabul government should take care of all these complainings from people. I mean, what people saying, if they listen them, and if they deploy more and more, I mean, soldiers, I mean, security forces in the north, I don't think that, as I said, there won't be any major changes, but we never know, like in Herat, like in Kunduz, like in Badakhshan, sorry, in Faryab. So it's just suddenly, you know, so if Kabul government is not ready for like any urgent, I mean, attacks, so I mean, the result could be like Kunduz and like the others. But in general, I don't think that there will be any changes.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I have a note here. I know my colleague is watching into her watch. Last question, Bruce. Where's the United States in China in all that I hear? Just briefly, I mean, just last question.
You know, I mean, obviously, both China and the United States are hoping that the situation will be stable, and they're, you know, again, they are to some extent helping the Central Asians out to guard their own borders and at least contain any problems from Afghanistan. You know, I mean, the United States is in the process of getting out of Afghanistan. I don't see that they're keeping the troop presence that they have there for now, but that, you know, I mean, we have to face it. The United States is disengaging from the region. China has always been interested economically, and they've never shown that they're willing to take a security role, even that close to their own border. So I think that ultimately what happens in Afghanistan is going to be left up to the Afghans, and all the parties, all the big powers will do what they can to help the Central Asians out to keep Afghan problems from crossing over the border. But basically what's going on in northern Afghanistan is going to have to be resolved by the Afghans themselves, because they can't. I don't see that they can count on very much support from outside actors.
All right. Thank you very much, Bruce Pannier, for the fascinating debate. We will certainly come back to the subject in some of our future discussion, either on our RLive or our weekly podcast Majlis. Dr. Luis, Senior Lecturer at the University of Exeter, Mustafa, Euronews correspondent from Kabul. Thank you very much for your participation, for your time, for your input in the debate.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. This is from me, Mohammed Tahir, Director of Turkmen Service at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in all the team in Prague, for listening, watching the podcast. Thank you. Bye-bye.